I invite you to stand. Were you there when they crucified our Lord?
Yes, we were there.
Were you there when they nailed him to the tree?
Yes, we were there.
Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?
Yes, we were there.
Were you there when they said, "This Jesus must die"? Let us pray. Lord, at times it causes us to tremble when we consider the sorrow, pain, and suffering you so freely took upon yourself for us. As we follow you to the cross, we can't help but ask why this horrible thing must happen. How is it that the shouts of Hosanna have so quickly turned into shouts of crucify him? But deep down, we know. Deep down, we know whose sin causes your death. It is our sin, our rejection, our treason that brought you to Calvary. Yes, we were truly there. We humbly pray that your love, forgiveness, and mercy that so greatly offended us may now be extended to us. Grant that we may die to our sin and so be raised to new life with you. We ask all of this and everything else in the words you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
You may be seated for the rest of the service. Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector who climbed up in a tree to see Jesus. Jesus honors Zacchaeus by eating in his home. Zacchaeus repents, and Jesus pronounces that Zacchaeus is saved.
I'll never forgive Jesus for that. Of all the people he could have stayed with, why Zacchaeus? Of all the inhabitants of Jericho, Zacchaeus was the worst possible choice. Zacchaeus was a traitor, a turncoat. He had sold out to the enemy. And to top it all off, he was getting rich in the process. You've got to hand it to the Romans. They are as smart as they are cruel. They knew how much we Israelites hated paying their stinking taxes. No one likes taxes, but it's twice as bad when the money goes to the empire that has conquered your country and now occupies it. And so, who do the Romans get to collect their taxes? Do they send in Roman tax collectors? No. They hire our people to do their dirty work for them. And how do we pay these dirty traders? Tax collectors can charge whatever they can get away with. And after they send in what Rome expects, they get to keep whatever's left. No questions asked. What sort of people would help the enemy and steal from their own people at the same time? I'll tell you what kind. Greedy pigs. Pigs who are out to make an easy buck, even if it means working for the Romans and stealing from your own people. And that's exactly the kind of person Zacchaeus is. Someone who betrayed his own people, happily got rich off their toil and labor, and through it all, helped keep the Romans in power. And oh, how rich he became in the process. He admits it himself. He promises to give half of his possessions to the poor and repay all of those he's defrauded 4 times as much. Where do you think he got all that money in the first place? He got it from us. He's cheated us and robbed us for years, while all the time he's lived high and mighty. And now he thinks he can make it all better by giving back part of what he's stolen. He makes me sick. It makes me sick to even think about it. And now, how does he get repaid for all of this evil? What's his punishment for selling out his own people? Jesus declares him saved. Of all people, Jesus says salvation has come to Zacchaeus. It isn't right. It isn't fair. Jesus has no right to say Zacchaeus will be saved. Zacchaeus is the worst kind of sinner. Jesus is way out of line. He's really kind of dangerous. Something should be done about him. We can't stand for this. This Jesus must die.
Jesus heals on the Sabbath. A woman comes to the synagogue where Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath. She has been crippled for 18 years. Jesus calls her over and heals her. The leader of the synagogue is furious that Jesus dares to heal on the Sabbath. Jesus calls him a hypocrite and points out that any of them would help an ox or a donkey to get water. So it is right to heal the woman.
I resent being called a hypocrite. I was just doing my job. I was the leader of the synagogue. I had to say something. I wasn't the one in the wrong. Jesus was the one making trouble. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking all Jesus did was heal this poor woman. How could that be wrong? It's not that Jesus healed her. It's when he healed her. He healed her on the Sabbath. Healing is considered work, and work is plainly forbidden on the Sabbath. Now, that's not my idea. I didn't come up with that rule. God did. It's the third commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. This Jesus has no right to go around breaking God's commandments whenever he feels like it. This may sound harsh, but it really isn't. Following God's commandments give order and structure to our lives. What would happen if people just decided to stop following the fifth commandment? You shall not kill. Society would fall into chaos. And that's why something as simple as healing on the Sabbath must be stopped. If that kind of thinking spreads, it can lead to all kinds of trouble. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not upset that Jesus healed the poor woman. It was a great act of kindness and an impressive demonstration of God's healing power, but not on the Sabbath. Why couldn't he have waited a few hours to heal her? Soon the Sabbath would have ended, and then everything would have been fine. She'd been this way for 18 years. Would a few more hours really have made any difference? If he had just waited, we could have avoided all this trouble. But for whatever reason, Jesus didn't wait. He just forged ahead, breaking God's law, ignoring our tradition, making a mockery of our way of life. And not only that, he drove a wedge between those of us in authority and the common people. Those of us with positions of leadership had no choice but to question his acts. It is our job to defend the tradition. But the common people are so swept up in Jesus' teachings and healings, they can't see the larger picture. They don't see how dangerous this Jesus is. We must put a stop to this. Jesus cannot be allowed to continue to cause trouble. He's dangerous. This Jesus must die.
Jesus teaches people to love their enemies. Jesus teaches to love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Turn the other cheek when someone strikes you. Offer your shirt also when someone takes your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. Do to others as you would have them do to you.
I can't believe this is happening. My teenage son has just come home spouting some new philosophy that's bound to get him in trouble. Those of you who are parents of teenagers will understand what I'm talking about. You know how impressionable teenagers are. There's always excited about whatever's the newest craze, no matter how crazy it is. One of the toughest jobs in the world has got to be raising kids and keeping them on the right track. The last thing we need is some crazy preacher filling our kids' heads with new and revolutionary ideas, especially dangerous ideas. How about this for starters? Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who abuse you. Can you believe it? That's the kind of ideas my kids are coming home with. And if that's not bad enough, this crazy preacher is telling my kids that if someone hits them, they should stand there and get hit a second time. He says, if a thief steals your coat, take off your shirt and give that to him as well. And then my favorite, give to everyone who begs. Can you believe it? He tells them to give to beggars. There's nothing worse than walking down a big city street and seeing all those beggars. And you know that whatever you give them won't make a bit of difference. It's just like throwing away your hard-earned money. If I've told my children once, I've told them 1,000 times, give beggars sympathy, not money. But do they listen to what we teach them? No, they'd rather listen to some preacher who doesn't have anything to give away. They'd rather listen to someone who sums up his philosophy like this: do to others as you would have them do to you. Can you believe that? The guy's got it backwards. It's supposed to be, do to others what they would do to you. I have no trouble being good to those who are good to me, and that's what I've taught my children. But this idea of loving your enemies and giving without getting back, that's crazy. I don't want my children throwing their lives away. I want my children to be happy and successful, and that means you've got to be tough. You've got to watch out for yourself, take what's yours, and fight for your rights. You know, this really ticks me off. I try to raise my kids to be responsible, successful people. And then this Jesus comes along and fills their heads with all sorts of mush. This Jesus is dangerous. Someone should do something about him. We can't just sit around and let him teach our children this kind of stuff. Jesus must be silenced. This Jesus must die.
Jesus forgives the woman caught in adultery. A woman is caught in the act of committing adultery and brought to Jesus by the Pharisees. Moses said to stone her. Jesus scribbles in the sand, then said, "Let anyone among you who is sinless cast the first stone." They went away. Jesus does not condemn the woman and tells her to go on her way and sin no more.
A gross miscarriage of justice took place that day. I was among the Pharisees who brought that shameful woman to Jesus. We knew it was his custom to go and teach at the temple, and we were sure we would find him there. And now we finally had a perfect opportunity to clear up all this confusion. It's one thing to talk about forgiving sinners. It's another to deal with a sinner who was caught in the act. We were sure Jesus couldn't weasel his way out of this one. Once and for all, we would make him acknowledge that sinners must pay. Everything was going perfectly at first. The adulterous woman never once denied her guilt, never once even begged for mercy. Like the rest of us, she knew she was wrong. She knew she deserved punishment. God's law must be upheld. Everything was going perfectly. Even Jesus made no reply at first. He just bent over and started drawing on the ground. At last, the great teacher had nothing to say. There was no way to get out of this one. This woman deserved death, period. When Jesus finally did speak, I thought we had won for sure. He said, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." He admitted she deserved death. We had won. Jesus couldn't deny the law this time. I started looking around for a stone to carry out the judgment. It was then that I realized something was wrong. The rest of the scribes and the Pharisees looked uncomfortable. I couldn't believe my eyes. They weren't going to stop them, were they? We were righteous people. We follow the law. We make proper sacrifices. We do what God expects of us. We had every right to judge this woman and then carry out the judgment. We were not caught sinning. She was. Then things went from bad to worse. Everyone started walking away. These people who had done everything in their power to follow God's law had been chased off by Jesus' trickery. Maybe none of us was completely without sin. Nobody's perfect. But we were surely better than this evil woman before us. It was all I could do to keep from shouting at my colleagues to stop. "What's the matter with all of you?" I wanted to say, "This woman deserves death. Don't let a little case of conscience cloud your judgment. Compared to her, we are without sin." But I said nothing. I just stood there as they all walked away. I finally left too. I couldn't believe this Jesus won again. Now more than ever, I know how much he must be stopped. He can't go on making a mockery of our law and accusing good people of being sinners. He's dangerous. This Jesus must die.
Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus tells the story of a man with two sons. The younger one demands his inheritance while his father is still alive. The son squanders it. There is a famine, and nobody will help him. He returns home to work as a servant for his father, but his father meets him on the way, rejoices, and throws a party to celebrate. The older son is bitter that his father is so merciful.
This parable wrecked my life. I'm serious, it wrecked my life. Let me tell you how. My father and I were there when Jesus told the parable you call the prodigal son, and it was almost as if he was talking about our family. My father has two sons, myself and my younger brother, and the similarities, unfortunately, don't end there. My younger brother is also a wasteful, spoiled, undisciplined, good-for-nothing. Of course, it took my father years to admit this. In the beginning, Dad always had an excuse for why his little boy didn't measure up. Soon my brothers didn't even need to make excuses. Dad would forgive him because he asked. And of course, I played my part in our little family drama. I was the responsible one. I did my share of the work and my brother's share. Dad finally did come to his senses. Somehow my father found the courage to admit to himself that this couldn't continue. He knew it wasn't right. And so Dad kicked my brother out. Those were the good days. We hired someone to take his place, and for the first time in years, the work started getting done. Schedules were met. Productivity rose. Everything went great. After time, even my father seemed to accept the loss of his son in exchange for efficiency and increased profits. But then it happened. Jesus came along. My father and I just happened to be there when Jesus was teaching. He started telling parables, one about a lost sheep, a second about a lost coin, and then Jesus started his third parable. There was a man who had two sons, and that was the beginning of the end. When the parable was over, my father was in tears and ran off mumbling something about his poor baby. My father came home late that night. He was half carrying my brother, who was too drunk to walk by himself. And before I could say anything, Dad announced that my brother was home to stay. That was all about 2 years ago. We went bankrupt a few months after my brother came back home. My father fell sick soon and died because we couldn't afford a doctor. My brother disappeared soon after, and I haven't seen him since. And me, I now work for minimum wage on someone else's farm. And all because of Jesus and his parable. You know, I don't know if my father really even understood what Jesus was getting at in the parable. Jesus was talking about how God treats sinners, not how fathers should treat their sons. It makes me angry every time I think about it. Just look what that kind of thinking did to me. Can you imagine what would happen if God really forgave sinners like that? How could he say such things? Someone should stop him. He's dangerous. This Jesus must die.
Jesus remains silent to his accusers. Jesus is brought to the high priest, chief priests, elders, and scribes. They bring people to testify against Jesus, but the testimonies do not match. The high priest asks Jesus for a response, but Jesus will not give an answer. Finally, the high priest asks Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus responds that he is. The high priest pronounces it's blasphemy.
For a moment there, I thought our case against Jesus might not hold up. We had lined up so many witnesses to testify against him that surely 2 of them would agree on some horrible things he had said or done. But we were having no such luck. None of their testimony was the same. I was afraid that we were going to have to let him go. I knew Pilate would not have him executed if we couldn't pin something solid on him and back it up with at least 2 witnesses. And if anyone needed to be killed, Jesus did. I had been hearing for months about all the horrible trouble he was causing, stirring up the crows, arguing with the religious authorities, even claiming to be the Messiah. That's exactly what I needed, some would-be Messiah to stir up the masses and start an armed rebellion against Rome. Can you imagine the bloodshed and the destruction? Not to mention the religious and political consequences. The last thing I needed was some blaspheming rabble-rouser to mess up everything I'd worked for. But now that we had finally brought him to trial, everything seemed to be slipping away. We were out of witnesses. We had proved nothing. We would have to let him go. I knew I had only one more chance, and I knew it was a long shot. But what other choice did I have? I asked him straight out, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" I didn't expect him to answer. I assumed he would just remain silent. I couldn't believe my ears when he answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with clouds of heaven." It was more than I could ever have hoped for in my wildest dreams. Right there in front of everyone, he openly admitted to being both Messiah and God's Son. We needed no more evidence. We needed no more witnesses. Pilate would have to do something now. Pilate would have to kill anyone claiming to be king or God, and this Jesus had just claimed to be both. Pilate would never know what a favor he was doing me when he sentenced this Jesus to death. Finally, all my troubles would be over. Jesus' reputation as a teacher, healer, and miracle worker would slowly fade away. His ragtag followers would disband, and all of this nonsense would come to an end. Order would be restored. Jesus had caused enough trouble. Someone has to do something about it. He's dangerous. He has to be stopped. He has to be silenced. There's no doubt about it. This Jesus must die.
A reading from Luke, the 23rd chapter. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying in a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things.
Can you believe this guy? Even as he hangs on the cross dying, he extends God's grace and mercy to those who don't deserve it. Who is he to say, "Truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise"? Doesn't he get it? Doesn't he realize that's exactly the kind of talk that got him crucified? We have had enough of this, of his offering God's grace and mercy to the undeserving. He can't be allowed to continue forgiving sinners like that. What about us? What about us good religious people? What about those who try as hard as we can to do what God expects of us? I mean, I might not be perfect, but at least we try. Don't we deserve something for at least trying? I hate to admit it, but I resent the fact that Jesus freely offers sinners what I have worked so hard to earn. Now I understand why so many people thought Jesus must die. His notion of God's forgiveness really is offensive to those of us who try our best to earn God's salvation. And I always assumed bad people thought that Jesus must die. All of a sudden, that other thing Jesus said from the cross makes sense. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." I never thought the "they" included me. It makes you wonder if we're as good as we think we are. We obviously need as much forgiveness as anyone else Jesus forgave. But it's too late now. Jesus is crucified. He's dead and buried. Without knowing it, we put to death the one God sent to save us. But we can't undo what we've done. It's out of our hands. I guess it's all up to God now.